The Atlantic Ocean covers nearly 1/5 of the Earth's surface. It stretches uninterrupted for thousands of miles, bordered by continents that are often far beyond sight or reach. In its central regions, the water deepens quickly, and the horizon becomes a clean, unbroken circle. There are no landmarks. Direction is inferred only by sun, stars, and instruments. In this part of the ocean, movement is constant but subtle. Long swells pass beneath the surface, generated by weather systems days or weeks away. Wind shifts gradually. The sea is rarely still, yet it often appears calm. For extended periods, conditions can feel stable, predictable, and manageable to those accustomed to open water travel. Commercial shipping lanes cross sections of the Atlantic, but between them lie wide areas where vessels may not encounter another human presence for days. Even modern navigation does not eliminate isolation. Radio contact can be inconsistent. Visual detection is uncertain. Distance remains a defining feature. During solo passages, sailors adapt to this scale by narrowing their focus. Daily tasks replace broader awareness. The boat becomes the environment. The ocean exists as a surrounding constant rather than an active threat. Time is measured by watches, meals, and changes in light. It was within this vast, indifferent setting that a single sailboat moved steadily across open water. There was no immediate danger. The voyage was proceeding as planned. The conditions were not unusual for the region or season. The sea, at that moment, offered no warning of what would follow. The sailor was a middle-aged man with years of experience at sea. He was not attempting a record or an unusual route. His journey was part of a longer pattern of solo sailing that had become common in the late 20th century, as improved navigation equipment and lighter vessels made independent crossings more accessible to private individuals. He had departed alone, by choice. Solo passages reduced complexity. There were no shared watches, no competing decisions. Responsibility rested entirely with one person. This required discipline, but it also allowed for consistency. The sailor planned his days carefully, balancing rest, navigation, and maintenance. Fatigue was managed through short sleep intervals. Meals were simple and repetitive. The sailboat itself was modest in size but capable of ocean travel. It carried standard safety equipment for the time, a life raft, emergency rations, signaling devices, and limited fresh water. Storage space was restricted, and weight had to be controlled. Every item on board served a purpose. There was little redundancy. Preparation focused on expected conditions rather than worst-case scenarios. The Atlantic crossing was intended to take several weeks. Weather forecasts suggested no major systems along the route. Seasonal patterns were favorable. The sailor had completed similar journeys before and was familiar with long periods of isolation. His motivation was practical rather than symbolic. The voyage was meant to relocate the boat, not to test endurance. Survival was assumed, not contemplated. The ocean was treated as a working environment, governed by routine and experience rather than uncertainty. Before departure, there were no indications that the crossing would deviate from plan. The vessel was sound. Equipment functioned normally. Communication schedules were established but limited, as was typical for solo sailors. As the days passed, the passage settled into a steady rhythm. Sails were adjusted. Position was checked. Small repairs were made as needed. The sailor adapted to the slow movement of the boat and the regular motion of the sea. The journey, at this stage, remained uneventful. The crossing took place during a season generally considered suitable for transatlantic travel. Large storm systems were less frequent, and prevailing winds offered steady progress rather than abrupt changes. For solo sailors, these conditions reduced the need for constant course corrections and allowed longer intervals of rest. Weather reports received before departure had indicated nothing out of the ordinary. At sea, the sailor relied on visual cues and barometric readings to anticipate changes. Clouds moved slowly across the horizon. Wind strength fluctuated within expected ranges. The ocean surface showed long, organized swells rather than chaotic motion. Day and night passed with little variation. Sunlight reflected off the water during daylight hours, making the horizon difficult to distinguish at times. At night, the absence of artificial light sharpened the visibility of stars. Navigation checks were routine. Position estimates were logged carefully, though precision diminished with time and fatigue. The sailboat responded predictably to the wind. Its movement was steady, with no signs of structural stress. Minor adjustments were made to sail trim as conditions shifted, but there was no need for urgency. The sailor remained within the normal operational limits of the vessel. Isolation was complete but not unfamiliar. Radio traffic from distant ships was occasionally audible, though no direct contact was made. The absence of other vessels was expected in this stretch of ocean. It reinforced the sense of distance but did not yet suggest risk. Fatigue accumulated slowly. Sleep came in short intervals, dictated by the need to monitor the boat. Meals were taken when convenient rather than at fixed times. These patterns were standard for solo crossings and had been managed successfully before. There was nothing to distinguish these days from many others spent at sea by experienced sailors. No single moment suggested that the voyage was approaching a critical threshold. The environment remained stable. The boat remained intact. The sailor continued forward, unaware that the margin for error was narrowing. The change did not arrive as a dramatic shift in weather. There was no sudden storm front or visible warning. Conditions remained within the range the sailor had already experienced during the passage. Wind strength increased modestly. The sea state grew more active, but not unusually so for open ocean travel. At some point, a wave struck the sailboat with enough force to destabilize it. The precise sequence of events is not fully documented, but the result was clear. The vessel capsized. The mast entered the water, and the boat failed to recover its upright position. Capsizing in open water creates immediate, cascading problems. Loose equipment becomes hazards. Water enters compartments not designed to be submerged. The sailor was thrown from his normal working position and forced to react quickly, with limited visibility and control. Attempts were made to secure the boat and assess damage, but the situation deteriorated rapidly. The sailboat began to take on water. Structural integrity was compromised. Systems that had functioned reliably were no longer accessible or operational. The sailor activated emergency procedures. He retrieved the life raft and essential supplies while conditions still allowed movement. These actions were carried out under pressure, but without evidence of panic. Training and habit guided the response. As the vessel continued to flood, remaining aboard became impossible. The decision to abandon ship was not framed as a choice but as a necessity. Once the life raft was deployed and boarded, the separation was final. The sailboat drifted away and sank, leaving no structure above the surface. What remained was a small, inflatable platform, surrounded by open ocean in all directions. From that moment forward, isolation was absolute. There was no vessel to repair, no course to steer, and no immediate expectation of contact with others. The sailor was alone, afloat, and dependent entirely on what had been carried into the raft. The life raft was designed for short-term emergencies. It was compact, enclosed, and barely large enough for a single occupant to lie down. Once inflated, it provided minimal protection from sun, wind, and waves. Its primary purpose was to keep a person afloat until rescue, not to support extended survival. Inside the raft, the sailor inventoried what he had managed to save. Emergency rations were limited and intended to last only a few days. There were small packets of drinking water, a basic first aid kit, flares, and a signaling mirror. A knife and a few personal items had also been brought aboard. Everything fit within arm's reach. The first priority was stabilization. The raft drifted freely, rising and falling with the swell. There was no anchor or means of controlling direction. Movement had to be minimized to reduce fatigue and prevent damage to the inflatable structure. The sailor adjusted his position carefully, learning how the raft responded to shifting weight. Exposure became an immediate concern. During the day, heat built quickly inside the enclosed space. At night, temperatures dropped, and condensation formed on the interior surfaces. Saltwater spray entered through small openings, soaking clothing and skin. Dryness was difficult to maintain. The sailor established a routine as soon as possible. Water was rationed strictly. Food intake was reduced to the minimum required to function. Each day followed a similar pattern, monitoring the condition of the raft, checking supplies, scanning the horizon, and conserving energy. Signaling attempts were limited by resources. Flares were used sparingly, only when distant shapes appeared that might have been ships. Most of the time, the horizon remained empty. The raft's low profile made detection difficult, even in clear conditions. Without navigation tools, the sailor could not determine his position with accuracy. Drift was governed entirely by wind and current. There was no indication of whether land lay closer in any direction. The raft became both shelter and confinement, offering survival at the cost of movement. As days passed, the scale of the situation became clearer. Rescue had not come quickly. The emergency had shifted into something longer and less defined. Survival would depend not on immediate response, but on sustained management of limited resources and the ability to endure prolonged uncertainty. Fresh water became the central constraint. The packets stored in the raft were designed to sustain life briefly, not indefinitely. From the beginning, the sailor treated them as a reserve rather than a daily allowance. Intake was reduced to small, measured amounts. Dehydration was managed rather than avoided. Rain offered the only opportunity to supplement supplies. When clouds gathered and precipitation followed, the sailor used the raft's surfaces and any available fabric to collect runoff. Water was captured in improvised containers and transferred carefully to the empty ration packets. Not every storm produced usable water, and some passed without rain reaching the raft at all. Food was even more limited. Emergency rations were consumed slowly, stretched far beyond their intended duration. Once they were gone, there were few alternatives. The sailor attempted to catch fish using improvised lines and hooks fashioned from available materials. Success was inconsistent. Energy conservation shaped every decision. Movement was kept to a minimum. Tasks were performed slowly and deliberately. The sailor avoided unnecessary exposure to sun and wind, understanding that fatigue accelerated dehydration and weakness. The raft's interior deteriorated over time. Constant moisture softened materials. Salt crystals formed on surfaces and skin. Small leaks required attention to prevent gradual deflation. Repairs were basic and temporary, relying on the limited contents of the emergency kit. Discipline replaced motivation. Days were not marked by progress or change, but by repetition. The sailor divided time into simple segments: daylight and darkness, wakefulness and rest. There was no attempt to count days precisely once initial estimates became uncertain. The calendar lost relevance as drift continued. Mental strategies were practical rather than reflective. The sailor focused on tasks that could be completed within the raft's confined space. Equipment was checked repeatedly, even when no changes were expected. These routines provided structure and reduced the sense of helplessness. Physical condition declined gradually. Weight loss was noticeable. Muscle strength diminished. Skin sores developed where constant contact with damp surfaces could not be avoided. Despite this, the sailor remained functional, adapting movements to reduced capacity. Throughout this period, signaling continued when possible. The mirror was used during clear daylight hours. Flares were reserved for moments when distant ships appeared, though none altered course. The vastness of the ocean absorbed these efforts without response. Survival became a matter of balance rather than hope. The sailor did not know how long the situation would last or whether it would end in rescue. What remained within his control was the management of each day. By limiting losses and maintaining routine, he extended his endurance beyond what the raft had been designed to support. Without instruments, movement across the ocean became abstract. The raft offered no means of propulsion and no way to steer. Direction existed only as a concept, inferred from the sun's path during the day and the orientation of stars at night. Even these references were unreliable, as the raft rotated freely with wind and swell. The sailor attempted to estimate drift based on prevailing conditions. Wind direction suggested a general movement, but currents were less visible. At times, the sea surface appeared to carry the raft steadily in one direction for days. At other moments, progress seemed to stall or reverse. There was no confirmation. Occasionally, floating debris passed nearby, small pieces of wood, fragments of plastic, bits of rope. These objects provided no useful information, but their presence reinforced the sense of motion. The ocean was not empty, but it was indifferent. Everything moved, but nothing converged. Ships were sighted intermittently. They appeared as faint silhouettes on the horizon, often indistinguishable from clouds at first. When the sailor was confident that a vessel was present, he prepared to signal. The mirror was aimed carefully. Flares were considered. On several occasions, signals were deployed without result. The ships did not alter course. Whether the signals were unseen or ignored was impossible to know. Each attempt reduced limited resources and underscored the difficulty of detection from a low, drifting platform. As time passed, the sailor adjusted expectations. Rescue was no longer assumed to be imminent. The raft's movement suggested a slow approach toward land, but this was speculation rather than evidence. The ocean offered no markers to confirm proximity to shore. Navigation, in the conventional sense, no longer applied. The sailor's role shifted from pilot to observer. He monitored changes in water color, the presence of birds, and the behavior of fish near the surface. These signs were ambiguous and did not consistently indicate land. Despite uncertainty, routine continued. Equipment was checked. Water was rationed. The raft was maintained as best as possible. The sailor remained alert to opportunity without relying on it. Drift defined the experience. Days accumulated without measurable progress. Direction became secondary to endurance. The ocean carried the raft according to forces beyond control, and the sailor's task was reduced to remaining afloat, attentive, and alive as that movement continued. The effects of prolonged exposure became unavoidable. Skin remained in near constant contact with damp surfaces, leading to sores that healed slowly or not at all. Saltwater irritated open areas and eyes. Infections were a persistent risk, managed only through cleaning and limited first aid supplies. Weight loss accelerated as food intake diminished. Muscle mass reduced steadily, affecting balance and strength. Simple movements required more effort. Sitting upright for long periods caused pain in the back and joints. Lying still for too long produced stiffness that was difficult to ease in the confined space. Dehydration shaped perception. Concentration narrowed. Periods of alertness alternated with long stretches of fatigue. The sailor experienced dryness of the mouth and throat, and his urine output decreased significantly. Water intake remained restricted, adjusted only when rain collection allowed brief increases. Sleep became irregular. The raft's motion prevented sustained rest, and discomfort interrupted short sleep periods. Night and day blurred, marked primarily by temperature changes rather than light alone. Time was no longer tracked in a structured way. Estimates of duration became approximate. Psychological strain increased without external stimulation. There were no conversations, no changes in environment, and no feedback beyond the immediate condition of the raft and the body. The sailor did not attempt to maintain morale through reflection or narrative. Instead, attention remained on immediate tasks and physical needs. There were moments when effort diminished. On some days, scanning the horizon required deliberate intention rather than habit. Signaling attempts became less frequent, not from resignation but from conservation. Each action carried a cost. Despite decline, basic functioning continued. The sailor maintained awareness of the raft's condition and responded to problems as they arose. Small repairs were made when leaks appeared. Loss was gradual rather than sudden. There was no single failure point. Instead, capacity narrowed incrementally. Survival depended on maintaining balance within this shrinking margin. The sailor did not know how much longer his condition would allow this equilibrium to continue. By this stage, the experience had extended far beyond any original expectation. What remained was endurance under constraint, sustained by routine and the absence of alternatives. After more than 2 months adrift, the character of the ocean began to change. The water took on a different color, less uniform than before. Floating vegetation appeared intermittently, passing close to the raft before slipping behind. These signs did not confirm proximity to land, but they suggested a shift in environment. Birds were seen more frequently. Some flew low over the water, others circled briefly before moving on. Their presence was noted without interpretation. The sailor had learned that signs could mislead as easily as they could inform. Eventually, land became visible. It appeared first as a faint, uneven line on the horizon, indistinct and easily mistaken for cloud or light distortion. As the raft continued to drift, the outline grew more stable. There was no change in pace, no effort required. The ocean carried the raft forward as it had since the sailboat was lost. The raft reached shallow water without incident. Waves altered their shape as they encountered the seabed. The motion became irregular, then slowed. The raft grounded near shore. The sailor was weak by this point, with limited ability to stand or walk unassisted. Movement onto land required time and caution. There was no immediate response from others, no signal or call. The arrival was quiet. Assistance came later, after the sailor was observed and local authorities were notified. Details of the initial contact are limited, but rescue followed established procedures. Medical attention was provided. The sailor survived. There was no celebration attached to the moment. The journey ended without commentary or conclusion. The ocean released the raft as passively as it had carried it. The sailor had survived 76 days alone at sea. The duration was established later, reconstructed from departure records, drift estimates, and medical evaluation. During the experience itself, time had not been counted with precision. Survival had not depended on knowing how long it had lasted, recovery took time. Physical effects of dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure were treated gradually. Strength returned slowly. Some injuries healed incompletely. The body adjusted back to land-based movement and routine with difficulty. The incident did not alter maritime practice or lead to changes in safety design. Life rafts continued to be built for short-term emergencies. Solo sailing continued much as before. The event was recorded, acknowledged, and then absorbed into a broader history of ocean survival. What distinguished the experience was not innovation or resistance, but endurance within limits. The sailor had not overcome the ocean. He had remained present within it, adapting to what could not be controlled. There were no lessons offered publicly beyond those already known. Preparation matters, isolation carries risk, and survival often depends on restraint rather than action. The Atlantic remained unchanged. The raft had carried one person across open water until land intervened. When it ended, the story closed without resolution or meaning imposed upon it. It remained a record